So how do we explain the impact that Jesus of Nazareth has had on our world? Has any one man so shaped the world in which we live like he has? Consider his impact on human history. Take the broad view. Today is the 18th of February 2024. That's 2024 years, roughly, since Jesus' earthly life. We divide history into before Jesus and after Jesus. We live in a culture here in Britain built on Jesus' teaching, our idea of human rights, the importance of protecting the weak, the beauty of self-sacrifice. It all comes from Jesus' instruction and example. And there are churches like this one meeting in Jesus' name all over the world today, in who knows how many languages. His impact on history and on our world is extraordinary. And then there's his personal impact, that is, the astonishing impact he's had on individuals, perhaps you or perhaps on someone you know. He stirred up an extraordinarily passionate devotion in people all over the world over the past 2024 years. His first followers gladly left behind virtually everything they owned in order to follow him. And many of them, in cultures hostile to Jesus, willingly lost their lives for his cause. There's been a steady stream of Christian martyrs ever since. And still today, all over the world, Jesus' followers are happily giving away their money, spending huge amounts of time, energy, and anything else as an expression of their passionate devotion to this one man. And the question for us this morning is why? What is it about Jesus that inspires such incredible devotion? If you're, as it were, sort of looking into Christianity from the outside, you're trying to make sense of it, this is the key to understanding it, or it's close to the key at least. If you can grasp why Jesus generates such passionate devotion from his followers, you'll be close to the heart of Christianity. Maybe the follower that you've got in your mind is your spouse. Or maybe it's your mum or your dad. Why are they so passionate about following Jesus? Why are they so passionate about me following Jesus? What am I missing? Or it might be that you're a Christian here this morning and you're concerned that you're not as passionate about Jesus, perhaps as a Christian friend. And you know that it's not just a personality difference between the two of you. So what is it? Why are they so much more devoted to Jesus than I am? What am I missing? Well, you'll have seen that our Bible reading this morning features an act of extraordinary devotion and a man who can't make any sense of it. So let's look at this story together in 3 scenes. Scene 1, great devotion. Great devotion, verses 36 to 38. The setup here is perfect. Jesus has been invited to the house of a Pharisee. We'll think more about this man Simon in a moment, but for now, all we need to know is that in the culture and at the time, the Pharisees were the good guys. Now, we don't use that word today. If we call someone Pharisaical, it's not a compliment, is it? But it would have been actually at the time. Put yourself in the shoes of an average Israelite. The Pharisees were the good guys. They were religious role models, the good examples for your children to follow. So there they are in Simon's house, and in that culture, you didn't sit at the table, you reclined, you lay at the table with your head near the food and your legs perhaps pointing away to the edge of the room, which sounds very relaxing. I don't know how it works for digestion, but it is very relaxing, isn't it? And it had the advantage of keeping your feet away from the food. Feet don't really belong anywhere near food, do they? But particularly not in that time and place. For a start, there's the footwear. Wandering around a shoe shop the other day, I picked up a pair of trainers advertising the use of cloud tech. You can check your shoes later on, see if they've got cloud tech. Sounds great, doesn't it? Like walking on a cloud. And as far as I could tell by studying the shoe, it means that they put holes in the spongy soles of the shoe so that they save on material and they charge you more. Well, they weren't wearing cloud tech trainers back then. Jesus would have worn a sort of open sandal, which over time would expose your feet to all sorts of general weathering, leaving them calloused and rough, and then walking through towns before the invention of modern sewage systems. I'll leave the rest to your imagination. If you'd set up a pedicure business in Jericho, say, in Jesus' day. You could have made a lot of money. So there they are, Simon the Pharisee, Jesus, any other invited guests, and maybe Simon's curious friends wanting a close-up of this remarkable man everyone's talking about. They're reclining, talking, eating, and into the room bursts an uninvited guest. Now, she wasn't just not invited, she would never have been invited into the house of a Pharisee. Verse 37, what do we learn about her? Have a look down with me, would you? What do we learn? She was a woman of the city who was a sinner. In other words, this is a woman with a reputation. No children were being told to look up to her by their parents. Her name perhaps was known around the town. For what? We're not told. We might speculate. Or was her reputation a certain kind of sexual reputation? Luke doesn't tell us. But Simon at least felt he knew what sort of woman she was. A sinner. Bursting in uninvited was bad enough, a breach of protocol, and in that culture, a woman approaching a man like this was bad enough, but without asking permission, she does something to leave the guests open-mouthed. She brings out a jar of expensive perfume, an alabaster flask of ointment. She could have made good money from this. If you're the sort of person who can't walk through the airport without stopping at the duty-free perfume, this might be the one that you'd spray test as much as you could, knowing it's well outside your price range. She opens the flask. She stands behind Jesus. And with tears running down her face, this isn't a single tear, this is a river running down her cheeks. She's sobbing. She begins to wash his feet with her tears. She uses her long hair as a flannel or a towel and then smears his feet with this expensive ointment, leaving them smelling fragrant. It wasn't uncommon to anoint a guest's feet when they arrived at your house after washing, but not perhaps with ointment like this. This is extravagant. This is so far above and beyond convention. It's emotional, it's sacrificial, it's passionate. Just think of those tears. You know, religion can make people cry, but maybe not these kinds of tears. If I try to remember religious services at school, I can well believe some of the boys having tears rolling down their cheeks as they yawned, willing it to be over. Rule-keeping doesn't generate this kind of passion. Religious rituals, keeping your nose clean, reciting the Ten Commandments doesn't stir up this kind of devotion. Perhaps the Christianity you've been exposed to before is a long way from this. A functional affair, a sort of a deal people make with God. I put in the good works, the church attendance, I say the prayers, I do the things, and God will stay off my back. I work out what I need to do to be okay with God, to reach the line, and that's it. It's a deal. It's not much more. That perhaps the priest tells me what hoops I need to jump through, and I jump through them, and I hope that I've done enough. But that's not this, is it? Can you see the difference? This isn't doing the bare minimum to get God off my back. This is the way that you'd respond to a person who'd run into a burning building to rescue you. This is the devotion of a person who owes them their very life. And what's so extraordinary about this woman's reaction to Jesus, as we look back now over whatever it is, 2024-ish years, is how ordinary it's proven to be, how common. I spoke with a man recently from a strongly Muslim background, growing up in a very Islamic country. He described to me the joylessness of the religion of his youth, how disillusioned with it he'd become, how he was given a Bible by a friend, introduced to an underground church meeting in secret, how he found Jesus, how the authorities discovered the church, and how he had to flee, leaving behind his home and his career. He left almost everything behind. He lost almost everything for the sake of being a follower of this Jesus. And I think if you asked him now whether he regrets it, with a big smile on his face, he'd say, no way. He'd found in Jesus so much more than he'd lost. And there are many others like him. I'll ask people here. Do they regret or resent the sacrifices involved in following this Jesus? No way. This is the kind of devotion the real Jesus inspires. And Simon the Pharisee has got a big problem with it. Shall we see that together? Secondly, great suspicion. Verse 39. Just verse 39, great suspicion. Did you notice as we read through, we don't learn Simon's name until verse 40. The first 4 mentions of him are to the Pharisee. Luke is underlining it for us. This man is a Pharisee, and the Pharisees, so far in Luke's gospel, have been incredibly suspicious of Jesus. Already in Luke's account, they've complained about the kind of company Jesus chooses to keep. Why do you eat with tax collectors and sinners? They've asked. And their attitude is easy to understand. As far as they're concerned, this is how it goes. God is good. True. Jesus is claiming to be the Son of God. True. They, the Pharisees, are good. So who should Jesus spend his time with? The good guys. People like Simon. Notice, he feels no awkwardness whatsoever about inviting Jesus to his house. Of course, Jesus should come to his house. Simon's one of the good guys. For people like Simon, and Simon here represents a typical religious way of thinking, the world is divided into the goodies and the baddies, the Pharisees and the tax collectors, the people who volunteer at their local charity, and the people who hang around on street corners late at night dealing drugs. And a great thick line divides the world into the good and the bad. Simon's on the side of the good, the woman's on the side of the bad. It's very simple. And if God is going to come down to earth, he's going to congratulate the goodies, and he'll cancel the baddies. He'll eat with the Pharisees. He'll stay 1,000,000 miles away from the sinners. God will give people like Simon a pat on the back and a medal on his chest for being such a decent bloke. And when this sinful woman comes round with her alabaster jar, Jesus will bolt the door. Is that what you think Christianity is about? Is that the kind of Christianity you've heard before? Stay on God's good side, keep the rules, go to church, say a prayer, avoid bad people. That's Simon's religion, and Jesus just doesn't fit. You see that in verse 39? Have a look with me, verse 39. Look what Simon was saying to himself. Notice he doesn't say it to Jesus, he's thinking this. If this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner. And notice here, by the way, the criticism here, and the criticism common among the religious of the time, was that Jesus is too tolerant of bad people. Isn't that ironic? Today, the criticism tends to be that Jesus and his people are too intolerant. Now, they can't both be right, can they? The fact is, Jesus doesn't behave the way Simon thinks he should behave. He doesn't fit into Simon's religious categories, and so Simon dismisses him as a fraud. How many people still do this today? Jesus can't be from God because he doesn't approve of what I approve of or condemn what I condemn. He can't really be sent from God because he doesn't fit my idea of what God is like. He doesn't communicate the way I'd expect him to communicate. He can't be from God because he hasn't appeared to me personally. He says things I find impossible to believe. If we write Jesus off because he doesn't behave or speak the way we expect him to, we're just like Simon. But if Jesus really is the Son of God, why would we expect him to behave in a certain predictable way? Why would we expect him to do all the things we think he should do? Why would we be the ones to tell him what to do or what to say? Why should Jesus fit into my categories? If he really was and is the Son of God, isn't it possible that he would disagree with me on certain things? That he might be able to teach me a thing or two? The real problem, though, with dismissing Jesus as a fraud in the way that Simon is doing here is that if we do that, we'll miss out on the sheer joy that this woman has found. And that's our third and final heading, great forgiveness. Great forgiveness, verses 40 to 50, great forgiveness. We're trying here, as we approach the third act of the story, to solve two puzzles running alongside each other. The first puzzle, if you like, is Simon's puzzle, and that is, if Jesus really is the all-good Son of God, how can he associate with such a bad woman? That's puzzle one. The second puzzle is the one we began with. Why does Jesus inspire in this sinful woman such extravagant and joyful devotion? And Jesus characteristically answers both puzzles with one short parable. Simon, he says, knowing, notice, by the way, what Simon's thinking, because he really is a prophet. Imagine two people owe the same man a debt. One owes a smaller amount, the other a larger amount. Imagine the man cancels both those debts. Which debtor will be the more grateful? Which debtor will love him more? Simon answers cautiously, doesn't he? I suppose. He suspects he's walking into a trap. But the answer's obvious, isn't it? It's the one who had the larger debt cancelled. When someone cancels a big debt, the natural response is big gratitude, maybe even big love. The biggest debt perhaps most of us have here is probably our mortgage. Imagine, and I hope you do have to imagine this, that you're finding it impossible to keep up with your mortgage repayments to the bank. A cost of living crisis, losing your job, you just can't pay. And the bank calls you into a meeting, and you know what that means. You drag yourself along to the bank with a knot in your stomach, an anxiety headache coming on. You sit across from the bank manager, waiting for her to tell you that they're going to have to repossess your home. And you're running through the scenarios. What are you going to do? Where are you going to live? What will you tell your spouse and children? The bank manager looks at you in the eye. We reviewed your repayments, and it's clear to us that you're unable to keep up. So we've decided, and you think, here it comes. The axe is about to fall. We've decided to write off your mortgage and give you the house for free. What would you do? Apart from getting her to repeat it, check you've understood, get it in writing with witnesses, photocopied 1,000,000 times, jump on the table, dance a jig, break down in tears, give her a hug. The point of Jesus' story is this. If you want to understand this woman's joy, if you want to understand the devotion that I've inspired, he says, in millions of people all over the world, you need to understand what I've done for them. I haven't come to congratulate the good. I haven't come for those who think they're good, for the self-righteous, the self-satisfied, for the smugly religious. I've come for people who know that they're bad. For people like this sinful woman, I haven't come to condemn, but to forgive. See, what Simon doesn't realize is that compared to God, no matter how religious we are, no matter how many rules we try to keep, no matter how many services we attend or how many charities we support, compared to God and compared to the people we're supposed to be, we're all on the side of the bad. We all owe a huge debt to God. We were made to live for him, to love him with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, to put him first as he deserves, to do his will, to live in such a way that displays his goodness. And all of us, without exception, have failed. Now, some of us may have failed this much, and others might have failed this much. For some of us, our debt to God might be this big, and others this big. The drug dealer might be more sinful, more in debt to God and his justice than the charity worker, but both are in debt. Both are sinful people. Both in their own way and in many different ways have lived in God's world by their own rules. Both have lived as though they're in charge, as though it were their will and their plan that mattered most. Both owe God a debt that no amount of religion or rule-keeping could ever pay. Imagine I go into that chat with the bank manager, knowing that I'm way behind on the mortgage repayments. And when they ask me about it, I offer them a £10 note. Will that do? That's what it's like to think that I can pay off the debt of my sin to God with a bit more religion. It's insulting, and it doesn't even come close. See, the difference between this sinful woman and the Pharisee is not that one is in debt to God and one isn't, that one's a sinner and one isn't. The difference between these two people is that one of them knows she's a sinner and in debt to God, and the other one doesn't. He's too blinded by a sense of his goodness to see how far short of God's standards he's fallen. In fact, when Jesus comes to his house, did you notice? He acts as though Jesus owes him something, doesn't he? As Jesus points out there in verses 44 to 46, he offered Jesus no water for his feet, no welcome kiss on the cheek or handshake, not even the cheap oil, let alone expensive ointment. But she's under no illusions. She knows the debt she owes to God for the way that she's lived. She knows the debt is too big to pay, even could she live 1,000 lives. She knows her only hope is to be forgiven, to have as an act of sheer kindness and grace her entire colossal debt paid off. And when she finds that forgiveness in Jesus, she falls on his feet with tears of joy. And by the way, it's really important that we see this. She's already found that forgiveness in Jesus before she pours out the ointment. Before this meeting, in fact, in the parable Jesus tells, did you notice the forgiveness, the debt cancelling comes first, and then comes the loving and grateful response. The parable is not love enough and you'll have your debt forgiven. Forgiveness first, then love. This woman has already been forgiven by Jesus, and we don't know when. Perhaps she stood in a crowd, probably at the edge, listening to him preach one of his messages of mercy and grace, heard his free offer of forgiveness, and she repented. She turned and she trusted for the forgiveness of her sin. She doesn't here come to Jesus for forgiveness. She already has that. She comes here to show him what it means to her. These are the tears of a person already forgiven and overcome with gratitude, joy, and love. She loves Jesus much because Jesus has loved and forgiven her much. And her experience is the experience of everyone who puts their trust in him. So for our last few minutes, let's consider these three characters in turn and ask what we're to learn, and then we're done. First, Jesus. Let's see together clearly what Jesus is claiming here. He's claiming to have the ability and the authority to forgive all of a person's sin. Did you notice how shocking that was to the other guests there in verse 49? Have a look with me, verse 49. Who is this who even forgives sin? See, they realize what a shocking claim this is. Now, each of us can and should, where we're able, forgive each other for the sins committed against ourselves. But what none of us can do is forgive a person sins they've committed against other people. Forgive all of a person's sins at once. We certainly can't forgive a person's sin committed against God, can we? I don't have that authority, do you? But Jesus is claiming to have that ability, that authority, which means that Jesus here is claiming to be God himself. Have you recognized Jesus' divine authority? Have you realized that he has the authority to forgive you everything you've ever done wrong? Do you realize that when Jesus forgives you, God forgives you, once and forever? Do you realize that this is why Jesus came, not to encourage a little bit more religion, not to congratulate those who falsely believe that they're good, but to save and forgive those who truly know they're bad? Have you come to Jesus and had your debt cancelled? Have you come to be forgiven? Secondly, let's think about Simon. Simon, we've seen here, represents the religious mind. He shows the big problems with so much Christless religious thinking, how it divides the world into the good and the bad, and how by making everything about good performance, it leads people either to hopeless despair. Simon had no good news for this sinful woman. Or in Simon's case, to self-satisfied pride, a sense of entitlement before God and before other people, a cold, dutiful, puffed-up self-righteousness without love or compassion or joy. Are you anything at all like Simon? Are you blind to your own debt to God? Are you trusting in your religious performance, your own goodness, to satisfy him, to pay that debt off? Can you see how joyless and hopeless that is? Are you holding out the £10 note of your own goodness, thinking it'll be enough? Or are you finally like this sinful woman? If you want to understand why it is that Jesus has inspired such passionate devotion in people all over the world, look at her. Being a Christian doesn't mean thinking you're good. It means knowing you're bad. It doesn't mean believing that you're the worst person that's ever lived. It does mean knowing that you've fallen well short. Knowing the sorts of things you're capable of and the evil that comes naturally out of your heart, as it does all of ours. And sometimes Christians are accused of being hypocrites, pretending to be good when they're not. I don't know many real Christians who pretend to be good. The qualification for being a Christian is knowing that you're not. A Christian is simply someone who's brought the crushing debt of their sin and guilt to the Lord Jesus and been forgiven. And the rest of their life is not lived as a sort of a begging letter, using religion to get what they want, but as a joyful, tear-stained, ointment-scented thank you letter. Thank you, Jesus, for forgiving me. Thank you for loving me.